The B-1B debuts as the world's most advanced long-range penetrating bomber, a long-awaited addition to this nation's strategic triad. Today, we have a bomber that is much smaller than the aging B-52. Yet because of improved engine performance and advanced aerodynamic design, it is capable of carrying a greater weapons load. Flying such a sophisticated aircraft requires equally sophisticated training. This new technology has provided us with a highly proficient aircrew. This same technology has given us an aircraft that is virtually maintenance-free.
The aircraft is performing great. The engines continue to be one of the brightest spots in the whole B-1B program. It's given us new technology in the command. It's one step in the right direction as far as maintainability, and we're getting a lot more for our tax dollars with a brand new weapon system than we were with ancient 30-year-old weapon systems.
If you get inside the B-1 cockpit, you're amazed initially at everything that you see. All of our instrument gauges, engine instruments, things like that are on ribbons. You can look up there and see a white line and tell instantaneously where your gauges are reading rather than having to try to interpret scales.
The electronics of the aircraft helps dampen out turbulence in areas such as low level, which actually enables you to fly a longer mission and not be as fatigued and be a more efficiently operating crew.
As an aircraft commander that's flown the airplane, it's a great airplane to fly. And if you're looking for a little excitement, a little adventure in your Air Force career or your life, or a new stepping stone at this point, I think the B-1 is the place to be.
This is Rockwell's B-1 bomber. It is one of only 4 prototypes ever produced. Had it been accepted by the United States Air Force, it would have been the fastest and highest flying bomber ever to go into service. The paradox is that the plane that ultimately did see service, although looking almost identical, flew at half the speed of the B-1 but was much more effective. The Air Force request for proposal, released in 1969, asked among other things for low-altitude ride control and nuclear hardness, the ability of the aircraft electronic system to resist the effects of a nuclear explosion. Again, the North American company took the lead. Now under its new banner, Rockwell put forward a concept that embraced the latest innovations, including swing-wing technology, but in proportions of a long-range heavy bomber. To prove the concept, an exhaustive wind tunnel program tested the shape, proportions, and function of Rockwell's proposed swing-wing Penetrator. In miniature, every flight characteristic and operational idiosyncrasy of what was to be the B-1 project underwent the closest scrutiny. Throughout the verification process, models were used in many different ways. Here, another scale replica of the B-1 using the same non-radar reflective materials as the final aircraft is tested. On a movable rig, its ability to hide from radar coming from any angle is thoroughly examined. The biggest and most impressive model in this process was the final full-scale mock-up. This faithful representation of the designer's ideas gave the manufacturers and the Air Force the feel of the final aircraft, in those years before computer technology made it unnecessary. The mock-up gave the last opportunity to explore the practicality of the concept before committing it to the expense of production. Even details like hinge doors and access panels are faithfully modeled so that the ground and flight crews alike can assess almost every physical detail on the finished aircraft. A variety of model weapon loads, both outside the aircraft and inside the bomb bays, look absolutely convincing and provide the closest possible insight to the real thing. So does the layout of the cockpit, and even the swinging mechanism of the wing works just the way it will on the production version. This level of perfection is a test to the model maker, but manufacture of the real thing was to challenge the engineer far more. There had been problems with the early F-111 wing box on which the swing wing pivoted. The B-1 bomber would carry a load many times greater than the F-111, so this facet of its operation was tested in the most punishing way. As always with the United States military aircraft, the greatest consideration was placed on the service's most indispensable asset. The preservation of aircrew was a major priority, and with the B-1 project, it would prove a substantial challenge. Rockwell's engineers tackled the problem of crew survivability from a stricken plane in exactly the same way General Dynamics had with the F-117 crew capsule. But for the B-1, with a crew of 4, it would have to be much larger, and tolerances would be greater. There was always concern about the effects on aircrew, not only from the force of ejection, but more importantly from the impact of landing. The F-111's capsule had worked well, but at this scale, and at the weight of 9,000 pounds, the problems multiplied. There was a real danger of spinal damage to crews on impact, so rapid-action airbags were developed to cushion the effects of the module as it hit the ground. Because of the nature of the B-1 mission, the airbags would have to work on land and on water. Meanwhile, at Palmdale, California, construction of the 3 prototypes began. The B-1 project was now underway, even if its long-term future was far from certain. Funding, as in most major defense projects, was to be a continuing problem. Senate criticisms of the enormous costs of the V-1 and the usual inter-service competition for the military budget were as difficult for Rockwell executives to handle as the new technology was for Rockwell's engineers. Here, the dedicated test rig is used to assess tolerance to stress to prove the integrity of the B-1's basic design. That integrity would have to be confirmed before any plane with the performance expectations of the B-1 could be allowed to fly in service. Eventually, after years of gestation and months of production, the first B-1 was displayed to the public on October 26, 1974. Its sleek lines were emphasized by its glossy white finish. At the time, it was the largest swing-wing aircraft in the world. The first B-1, serial number 74-158, rolls down the Palmdale runway on December 23, 1974, for its first maiden flight. Originally, plans called for 5 flying prototypes and 2 for structural testing, but because of cuts to the program, only 3 planes were ordered. The second and third of these were not to be available for flight testing for over a year. So on the first flight to the first plane, more than usual precautions were taken without a ready replacement. Loss of this prototype could cause the whole program to collapse. Little surprise, then, that the first short flight to Edwards should be accomplished with wheels down. nor was any attempt made to alter the position of the enormous swinging wings. But the two-man crew did adjust the jet exhaust system. This complicated arrangement is sometimes referred to as the turkey feathers for obvious reasons. To control the final stages of up to 30,000 pounds of thrust with full afterburner is a difficult but vital function. Edwards is the traditional base for testing. Once called Mach, this Air Force facility has been the home of many major test programs. Here, from the dry Californian desert, the first B-1, with the hopes of Rockwell and the Air Force in the balance, would undergo the most thorough flight testing. All the while, its detractors looked for the slightest flaw to capitalize on. Already, there had been problems with cost overruns. These had been added to by the government decision to produce fewer planes, substantially increasing the unit cost. Also, the decision to stretch the early delivery schedule created problems with the aircraft's 3,000 subcontractors. Logistics must have been a nightmare. Although the first short flight of the B-1 was a totally successful exercise, its future was still far from secure, and much of the real flak the program was to encounter had little to do with the plane's performance. Rather, the arguments were of need, philosophy, and politics. Did the Air Force really require a new bomber? How valuable was a recallable man deterrent? Genuinely informed assessments of whether the B-1 might be able to achieve its mission requirements were less easy to find, and, against this backdrop of uncertainty, engineers and test pilots would have to prove Rockwell's super bomber. As the testing continued, the sole flying example of the B-1 was carefully put through various stages of the test program. Soon, the enormously powerful and complex landing gear was to be retracted and extended. Years earlier, when Rockwell was still called North American, and it was testing the XB-70 Valkyrie on its first prototype mission, the gear failed to retract properly, but the B-1's initial attempt at a clean profile flight was a total success. With something as complicated as the undercarriage, tremendous effort is expended in testing prior to flight, but in the end, the one that really counts is in the air. Throughout 1975, Rockwell's single-flying B-1 ran a gauntlet of tests, including the crucial wing sweep function from straight wing to delta shape. There was a comprehensive testing of the 4 General Electric F-101 fan jet engines and of the delicate task of aerial refueling, necessary even for a plane with the range of the B-1. It was tested in high-level flight at over 50,000 feet, then down to the deck for the all-important below-the-radar barrier trials, flying over 600 miles an hour at less than 200 feet. In these circumstances, the small vanes of the low-altitude flight control system were vital. Government cuts to the program meant that only 3 prototypes were to be built. The first of these was to fly, and the second was for structural testing. At the end of 1975, the stress tests were complete, and the aircraft was released to be fitted out for flying, but it would not be available till May the following year. In January of 1976, the third aircraft built for flight testing came online. This aircraft would concentrate on much of the complex avionics equipment used in the B-1 program, especially the Boeing-built offensive electronic system, a vital part in the B-1 mission. Inside the cockpit of these prototypes, a complicated array of dials and meters surrounds the cathode ray tubes. If you look closely, you can see the fighter-like control columns, unusual in the large aircraft. Directly behind the pilot and co-pilot, the other two crew members sit in their positions. The defensive and offensive systems operations use the high point of radar development not only to identify and target the enemy, but also to fend off attacking opposition fighters. It's a far cry from the air gunner huddled in the rear of the B-17. The B-1 crew fly in comfort, but in combat, they'd face the same old risks fighting off the late 20th or 21st century bandits. As the testing of the first three aircraft continued, with the speed and altitude envelope being constantly pushed, a fourth plane authorized for August 1976 production started its early stages of construction. With this latest B-1 underway, it seemed the program had gained significant momentum to survive its critics. With so much research behind it and so many of the problems solved, it appeared certain the Rockwell bomber would continue into production. But then, on June 30th, 1977, the recently elected Carter administration canceled the project, and the B-1 program came to a halt. A unit cost of over $100 million was not the least of the reasons for cancellation. But there were others. One influential factor was the earlier success testing of a unique combination of two proven pieces of American hardware, a Minuteman missile and an AC-5 transport aircraft. It could be demonstrated that the C-5 was capable of launching the missile in flight. Then it could offer the Air Force an extremely cost-effective form of wreckable deterrent. The survivability of a massive transport aircraft as it approached the combat zone may not have been great, but the extra range offered by the missile may have combined to produce some form of deterrent if the experiment worked. Although it was not to be adopted as a complete system, the air launching of an ICBM was nevertheless a spectacular achievement. It may yet have some potential. A much more concrete threat to the B-1 came in the form of the Air-Launched Cruise Missile, or an LCM. These are clever and extremely deadly weapons. Before extension, their wings and tailplane fold flush to the main body, so that many such missiles can be carried under the wings or in the internal bomb bays of the B-52. The AICM program, which was quickly implemented by the Carter administration, gave the aging B-52s a new lease on life as a suitable delivery system. The cruise missile uses small air-breathing jet engines, and with their extended wings and subsonic speed, obviously owe something to the original cruise missile, the German V-1 of World War II. But 30 years of technical evolution enabled the addition of concepts similar to the terrain-following radar first used in the F-111. This produced a weapon that was at the same time economical and effective, and considerably extended the range and survivability of the B-52. One thing was certain: after the Carter decision to cancel the B-1, the B-52, old as it was, would have to carry on as America's only long-range recallable deterrent. But, although more life could be squeezed out of those remarkable aircraft, it was equally obvious that in the long term, A new delivery platform of some kind was inevitable. Even with the support of dedicated bomber versions of the F-111 and the ACMs, the heating power of America's strategic air force was starting to wane. In spite of the discussed conversion of transport aircraft to carry cruise missiles, it had been known for many years that survivability over or even close to the enemy's airspace required specialized aircraft, and the missile-carrying transport would be limited to a type of delivery far less challenging than the Air Force would expect from a B-52 replacement. Clearly, a long-range penetrator was needed. Although the Carter decision had cancelled production of the B-1, it had allowed some funds for the continued tests of the first 3 planes and to complete the building of the 4th. It was with these 4 aircraft that Rockwell started to resurrect the program. But much time had passed since the cancellation, and if the swing-wing bomber was ever to reach production, it would be vastly different from the original concept. In some ways, time had worked into the plane's favor. New ideas were now becoming available, and with flying test vehicles on hand, their qualities would be quickly verified. The most important change to strategic thinking was the revised attitude toward high speed. The first parameter for the B-1 had been that it could fly at over 50,000 feet and speeds in excess of Mach 2, twice the speed of sound, and then, as it approached the enemy radar, the plane was expected to drop to 200 feet in high subsonic speed to make its final run undetected. But later thinking claimed that Mach 2's speed performance was of no real strategic value. Low and slow, if 600 plus miles an hour is slow, was seen as the best way for a long-range penetrator to reach its target. The reduction in top-end speed requirement would enable other benefits to be introduced in the new plane and would also contain costs. Much greater emphasis was placed on making the plane invisible by using non-radar reflecting materials. The new bomber would appear to be less than 1% of the size of a B-52 on enemy radar screens. In-flight refueling for optimum range was given even greater priority, as there had been unfounded criticism of the early plane's results at low level. A major change was implemented for crew survival. By deleting the crew ejection module, which had never been perfected, in favor of conventional ejection seats quite suitable for the slower flying version. With revised specifications from Rockwell and the pressing need to solve the B-52 replacement problem, the Reagan administration announced in October of 1981 the decision to build 100 Rockwell bombers, to be called the B-1B. The 4 earlier prototypes, which had done so much valuable work to prove the basic and later the modified concepts, would continue in test programs as the B-1A. It is entirely possible that had these 4 original aircraft not been available, the entire B-1B, the born-again bomber project, would have never gone underway. The B-1B was to have many new features, including a modified and vastly improved bomb bay. These cavernous areas can now be adjusted to accommodate different weapons, loads, and fuel requirements. Clearly, given the success the cruise missile had enjoyed, it would also have to be accommodated. Because the B-1B would be the B-52's replacement, the new aircraft would have to accommodate conventional and atomic devices in variety of sizes and configurations to fulfill a range of operations. Given this need for flexibility and the far-reaching scope of the B-1 project, it's hard to imagine that serious consideration was not so long ago given to use transports like the C-5 to carry cruise missiles, and that this combination was supposed to replace the classic B-52. As the B-1A continued to prove the new performance specifications, work on the B-1Bs was well underway at Palmdale. The total cost of 100 B-1Bs was to be $20 billion, or over $200 million a plane. But with the lessons learned from the disruption of the earlier program, at least the B model was certain of completion, and this meant, in the long term, the best value for the money. Much of the B-1B's cost goes to provide its sophisticated avionics equipment. Fixed antennas and radar dishes literally project from every angle of the fuselage, all gathering information for its computers to analyze. From this data, the crew will make decisions that may well resolve the outcome of a mission with historic importance, and the fate of the aircraft and those that fly it could equally be at stake. All things considered, perhaps the Rockwell swing-wing bomber is not so expensive after all. Many types of skill and technology are employed as the tens of thousands of parts come together, and the giant technological jigsaw puzzle that is the making of a modern bomber starts to take shape. By the middle of 1983, the first B-1B production model was ready to make its public debut. Looking so very much like its predecessor, the new planes are hard to distinguish from those which had first appeared almost a decade earlier. Modified air intakes and a small window for the radar operators are subtle but effective clues for the untrained eye. However, the performance variations are not so subtle. The B-1B, flying with half the speed potential of an A model, uses 21st century materials to become the most invisible to enemy fighters and missiles, and therefore is far more likely to complete its mission. And all the time it's on its deadly journey, it's providing tacticians with the flexible option of a last-minute recall. A role only the manned bomber can perform, but a role that was often understated in the past. Having survived against competition that started with such crude weapons as the V-1 flying bomb, and later evolved into the sophisticated and extremely deadly cruise missiles that would be carried by the aging B-52s, and having been eclipsed by the development of ballistic missiles, which began with the German V-2 rockets, and over time, developed into the powerful intercontinental ballistic missiles that have completely dominated the topic of nuclear delivery for over 30 years. The manned bomber survived by using yet another German innovation, the one of the variable swept wing. In the early 60s, the idea, greatly refined and used in conjunction with terrain following radar, emerged as the F-111. A very successful medium-strike bomber. And in the early 70s, the concept was further developed into the B-1, the ultimate high-speed, long-range, manned bomber. But it was to take another 10 years, and the arrival of still more advanced construction materials and another generation of avionics before the later model, the B-1B, was able to reach service. A masterpiece of high technology, the best that aerospace industry could offer, had finally arrived. It continued to fly well into the 21st century and doubtlessly became a legend similar to the B-52 we've replaced. But clearly, the B-1B, the born-again bomber, was already one of the world's greatest planes. In many ways, development of the B-1 paralleled development to the very first strategic bomber, the B-17, in that the B-17 also had to deal with an array of problems. The history of the B-17 began when the Army Air Corps circulated a specification for a multi-engine bomber. They probably only expected manufacturers to respond with a twin-engine design, but the Boeing company, showing what was to be characteristic foresight, offered a four-engine plane. As advanced as it may have been, Boeing's Model 299, as the prototype was known, was not very well received. An accidental crash in the early trials and a belief in some quarters that a large four-engine plane would be too difficult to fly in combat cost Boeing the initial order. And yet, certain factions in the Air Corps encouraged Boeing to continue development of what was, for its time, a massive aircraft. Using much of its own money and fighting government cutbacks, the company continued to develop what was ultimately to be a most important plane.
It's August 17th, 1943, just another day for the men of the U.S. Army Air Corps in England. Dawn breaks over the mist-shrouded countryside of East Anglia to reveal a scene of bustling activity. Ground crewmen hurry about making last-minute preparations for the day's mission. Bombs are loaded, engines are tuned, machine guns are cleaned, while every round of ammunition is checked and rechecked. In nearby Quonset huts, thousands of aviators anxiously await the start of today's briefing. Silently, they pray that they'll be given a milk run, perhaps a rail yard in France, a German airfield in Belgium. But when their grim-faced commanders step before them, they know that today's mission will be a rough one. It was a modern marvel, armed with 13 machine guns and capable of flying 2,000 miles or more with its load of deadly explosives tucked inside its bomb bay. The world had never seen such power in an aircraft, and only the most advanced nation could have even conceived of such a destructive weapon. Each flying fortress carried aloft 6 miles of electrical wiring within its metal frame. Its generators could light all the rooms in a good-sized hotel. Each B-17 carried enough steel for 160 washing machines and enough aluminum for 50,000 percolators. The rubber used in its wing deicers could retread almost 1,000 automobile tires. Each B-17 cost almost $500,000, a huge sum for the time. The B-17 was truly an American weapon, complex, expensive, huge, larger than life. And it had been built for a uniquely American role: daylight precision bombing, a role that was hoped would shorten the war by knocking out factories vital to Germany's war effort. And on this day in August of 1943, the B-17s and their crews would set out to prove that they could get the job done. Far from a milk run to France, the targets for today would be the Regensburg Messerschmitt plant and the ball bearing factories around Schweinfurt.
Schweinfurt had dozens and dozens of ball bearing plants and factories around the city. In fact, Schweinfurt produced between 30 and 40% of all the ball bearings used by Germany and its allies. So the philosophy was, if you could knock out the ball bearing factories around Schweinfurt, the German Army and Air Force, actually, and Navy, would grind to a halt because they wouldn't have ball bearings, which was a key component to any mechanical item.
The 8th Air Force would be sticking its head right into the Tiger's jaws, and the Tiger would be waiting. With the briefing concluded, the bomber crews climb aboard trucks and jeeps for the short drive to their own flying forts. The B-17s are ready to go. The mechanics and armorers have worked through the night to make sure that every bomber is fit to fly. The plan calls for 2 groups of bombers to coordinate their attacks on Regensburg and Schweinfurt. The 4th Bomb Wing's 139 B-17s would go in first, hitting the Messerschmitt factory, then flying on to North Africa in an effort to confuse the German defenses. Meanwhile, close behind the 4th Bomb Wing would come the 1st Bomb Wing's 222 flying fortresses. They would sneak in behind the 4th and destroy the ball bearing factories around Schweinfurt. Bad weather ruined the plan. The Luftwaffe almost ruined the mission. The B-17s form up over England before heading out toward Germany. The 4th Bomb Wing is already 90 minutes late. They'll be lucky to reach North Africa by sundown. As the first 139 bombers cross into Belgium, the second wave of bombers still hasn't even left the ground back in East Anglia. In fact, the 1st Bomb Wing would be delayed 5 hours. The attackers would go in piecemeal, and the Luftwaffe would tear them to pieces. The 4th Bomb Wing is attacked first. Scores of German Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s rip into the bomber formations. They concentrate on the trailing squadrons in the 15-mile-long bomber stream.
The Germans threw something on the order of 300 fighters at these 147 B-17s, and the low group was the most vulnerable, and the 100th Bomb Group earned its reputation that day that has stuck with them for 60 years, 50, 60 years, as being known as the hard luck outfit. They called it the Bloody 100th.
Convinced that the B-17s will soon be turning back for England, the Luftwaffe ground controllers scramble every fighter in northwest Europe. They're surprised when the 4th Bomb Wing heads south toward Africa. But they have plenty of targets anyway, for right at that moment, the Schweinfurt-bound Boeings of the 1st Bomb Wing reach the continent. They're set upon by hundreds of German fighters. The B-17s are hacked out of the sky with frightening frequency. One American gunner watches in horror as 12 bombers fall in flames around him, spilling white parachutes all over the sky. One combat wing loses a third of its planes. Entire squadrons are shot up, and only the Boeing's inherent rugged durability keeps the disaster from getting any worse. Of the 222 B-17s in the second raid, 196 reach Schweinfurt. So shot up and shocked are the crews that they scatter their bombs all over the city. The ball-bearing factories are hit, but not knocked out.
The area where the ball-bearing industry is located was definitely, for first impression, devastated. But as I walked from the airbase, there was no public transportation in Schweinfurt at that time, to the railroad station. I noticed that certain sections of the big factory, there was still steam coming out, they were still operating, still working.
The battered survivors turn for home and fight their way back out of Germany. Those flying forts that still remain in the formations are almost all peppered with holes. Flak has claimed a few bombers, but most have been hit or downed by aggressive fighter attacks. Just before dark, the bombers reach home. In England, the sky is filled with battered B-17s limping home. Some of the bombers reach East Anglia with 1 or 2 engines out. They crash land on any available airfield as ambulances and fire trucks race toward their shattered hulks. Precision daylight bombing, the very reason the B-17 had been invented in the first place, had failed in the face of Germany's deadly air defenses. Still, the 8th Air Force's leadership would not give up. The bombers would soon fly again. The bloody losses over Regensburg and Schweinfurt can be traced back to the U.S. Army Air Corps' concept of strategic bombing that evolved during the 1920s. By destroying arms factories, aircraft assembly plants, ball-bearing plants, and other such strategic targets, an enemy's Army and Air Force wouldn't have the means to carry on the fight. They would be forced to surrender as their nation's wartime economy crumbled under the weight of this precision bombing campaign. It wasn't until 1935 that the Americans developed a bomber capable of carrying out such a grandiose strategy.
Well, B-17 was a 4-engine heavy bomber designed in the mid-1930s by the Boeing Aircraft Corporation. And its primary role was to destroy enemy industrial targets through high-altitude precision bombing. And in that role, it was uniquely suited. It turned out to be one of the best aircraft probably ever built for the role that it was designed for. Mainly because, first off, at high altitudes, the B-17 was an amazingly stable aircraft. The reason for that was the fact that it had a very large wing. With a large wing area, the plane was very stable in flight. It was an excellent bombing platform. And most importantly to the crews was the fact that because it was stable, they could fly in very tight formations, so they could stick together.
The Boeing Model 299, prototype of the Flying Fortress, flew for the first time in August of that year. It would take several more years of development before the first production models reached operational squadrons, but when they did, they were the best and most modern bombers in the world. For its time, the B-17 was huge. With its 100-foot wingspan and 70-foot length, it towered over other late 30s aircraft. Later versions, including the B-17G, came equipped with 4 Light Cyclone radial engines that cranked out 5,520 total horsepower. And the Fortress needed every bit of power to drag aloft its typical bomb load of 14 500-pound bombs over a distance of 3,600 miles. Top speed was about 290 miles per hour, but in tight formations and heavily loaded, the Boeing cruised at about 170. With its heavy defensive armament of 13 machine guns, the Air Corps believed that the B-17 could successfully fight off enemy interceptors without help from escorting fighters. This was a major issue as the Air Corps didn't have any fighter aircraft capable of flying long distances with the bombers. But since the Flying Fortress had so many 50 and 30 caliber machine guns, such a long-range escort fighter seemed unnecessary. The B-17s would strike their targets alone, flying in tight, mutually protecting formations. In 1943, the 8th Air Force unleashed its first sustained bombing campaign against Germany. Codenamed Operation Point Blank, the B-17s were sent to knock out the Third Reich's aircraft industry. By destroying the Luftwaffe's production centers, the 8th Air Force would gain control of the air over Europe. With that in hand, the bombers could be sent against other strategic targets, striking at the heart of the Reich's ability to wage war. Point Blank was the first clash between the American pre-war doctrine and the realities of modern air combat. The results were soon clear, but the Americans doggedly persisted in putting their theories in practice at the expense of thousands of brave young men.
About the time we dropped the bombs, we started getting hit real close. One engine got hit, started losing oil, waited till there was not enough oil pressure. We couldn't feather the engine. So then they windmill just from the air. And eventually they may twist the shaft off and the prop will come off. God knows where it'll go. Or they can shake a wing loose, I guess. Not a very good situation. And I don't remember if it was in that engine or another one, the fire started. I don't know if they got that one out or not. And apparently the underside of the 17 was pretty well shot up. Sort of dropped out of the formation and started losing altitude. And wasn't too long till the pilot rang the bailout bell. And that was it for that mission.
The most important flaw in the precision daylight bombing campaign was the lack of a long-range escort fighter. Even the B-17's numerous defensive guns could not protect it from determined German fighter attack. The Luftwaffe soon learned to hit the B-17 formations from the front, which proved to be the weak point in the Boeing's defensive systems. Sometimes 40 or 50 Me-109s or FW-190s would swoop down at the bombers in a blazing head-on pass, aiming for the cockpit and engines. Nothing could stop such devastating attacks, and the fortresses took appalling losses.
Our biggest concern, really, in all honesty, were the young men that were over there before I got there. They had a lot of fighters that they had to contend with. The average mission completions that they had, I think, was about 7. And here we finished 35, so that tells you something right there.
If you lost an engine, or if you feathered an engine, that was very apparent to the Germans. And they'd pick on you right now. And they like to make holes in the formation. If they could knock a plane out of formation, you were definitely crippled. They knew how to do that.
Without long-range fighter escorts, the 8th Air Force's B-17 groups lost 40% of their crews during 1943. Only a quarter of the bomb crews were able to fly a full tour, 25 missions, and go home that year. An average crew flew 5 to 7 missions before getting shot down. Some who flew longer usually came home more than once with a shot-up bomber and injured crewmen aboard. Randall Jarrell, an 8th Air Force airman, wrote a poem that captured all the horror and intensity he and his fellow Flying Fortress crews faced in a piece titled "The Death of a Ball Turret Gun." From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from Earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. Such losses had a profound effect on morale and on the emotional health of the remaining B-17 crews. With buddies going down on every mission, the men became fatalistic. They clung to good luck charms and became increasingly superstitious. Others gradually lost their combat edge as battle exhaustion wore them out. In some cases, men broke down entirely and became psychiatric casualties. About 4% of all 8th Air Force losses in World War II were psychiatric cases. These were men who performed their duty admirably until the stress and strain of constant combat finally broke their emotional back. Such men were called flak happy by their peers, or said to have the Baka-Wolf jitters.
During the war, the 8th Air Force suffered roughly 50,000 KIA, WIA, and MIA. Tremendous amount of guys lost their lives or were physically injured. But also, as the stress and strain of combat began to manifest themselves on these crews, it became clear that the 8th Air Force was going to have to do something about psychiatric casualties. They were starting to lose crews, starting to lose pilots, starting to lose gunners to emotional trauma. And so one of the things that the 8th Air Force did was they set up a series of rest homes for crews that had been through particularly horrendous ordeals. Or later on in the war, they were sent there just as a matter of course. These were called flak leaves, and they'd go back to these country manors way out of the way from any military installations, and they would be able to eat and relax, and that actually helped get some of the emotional problems that the crews were suffering under control. Now, this never threatened operations for the 8th Air Force. It was always a very small number of the crews. Wartime reports had it that of every 1,000 men that flew combat with the 8th Air Force, 42 were going to become psychiatric casualties of one sort or another. And they were called permanent psychiatric cases if they were not returned to flight duty within 15 days. During the war, about 4,000 airmen and pilots fell into this category.
Through these brutal months, the crews learned to love their B-17s. The Flying Fortress had a ruggedness that sometimes defied imagination. They came home with 2, sometimes 3 engines knocked out and great gaping holes torn in their aluminum skins. Controls shot away, landing gear ruined, hydraulics blown out, flaps gone, and chunks of wing or tail hacked out by cannon shells didn't stop the rugged Flying Fortress. They came home limping, shattered and ruined, but still able to get their crews safely on the ground one final time. Hundreds of B-17s would return to England, never to fly again. They would be dragged off to the boneyards, where their broken bodies would be picked clean of spare parts that could be used to keep the other planes flying. To their crews, these faithful planes were utterly beloved.
We've flown on 2 engines, but you're coming downhill. That makes a lot of difference. You don't have fuel, you don't have bombs, and you're coming downhill and you can go long ways. But the old B-17 was a tough son of a gun. It can just get holes all over it, and it's still going to come back. The B-17 just had a great big old slab, and it flew real slow. And it wasn't real high compression, so it could take a lot of punishment.
One way the crews expressed their deep feelings toward their planes was through nose art.
nose art had some significance. It was a means to personalize a very impersonal weapon. A military aircraft is not a very personal thing, especially when 12,000 of them just like it are flying around in the world. So this was their way, the crew's way, to put their unique stamp on their aircraft and make it their own. And once that happened, that aircraft ceased to become just a collection of metal bolts and welded pieces of aluminum. It became almost a living, breathing part of their integrated crew. And so when you talk to crews who had their own aircraft for an extended period of time, they feel very, very strongly, very passionately towards that airplane, especially the B-17s that were so faithful and so rugged. And the crews will talk about their aircraft almost as if they were people.
With worn-out crews and demoralized bomb groups, the 8th Air Force continued to attack targets in Germany even after the August 17th Regensburg-Schweinfurt debacle. Post-war analysis later confirmed that the destruction at Regensburg cost the Germans some 1,000 Me-109s in lost production. What the Americans didn't realize was that the German aircraft industry was expanding at such a tremendous rate that those 1,000 planes were insignificant. Never once during the war did the Germans suffer from a lack of interceptors. In October of 1943, the 8th Air Force launched another concerted effort against targets in Germany. On October 8th, the B-17s bombed Bremen, losing 30 out of 399 planes. The next day, 36 more B-17s were lost attacking aircraft factories at Ockhelm and Marienbad. The missions continued, and the stress on the crews grew even worse. In 1 week, from October 2nd through the 9th, the Germans shot down or damaged beyond repair over 100 flying forts. The 8th Air Force lost almost 1,000 men. And still, the worst was yet to come. On October 10th, the B-17s struck Münster. The Luftwaffe bored in on the bombers, concentrating on the low squadrons of the 100th Bomb Group. Flying a straggly, loose formation, the 100th turned out to be easy meat. Within minutes, the entire group was virtually wiped out. Hitting Münster cost another 36 B-17s and over 300 Americans. The lesson from Münster was clear. Flying in loose formations would get many men killed.
There was one group that flew pretty scraggly formations, yes, elements or formations. Some of them consequently were hit harder than ours. Our group flew good, tight formations. They wanted the wing of the side plane tucked right in behind the wing and in the waist of the other. In other words, tight elements of three. By having those wings all tucked in, concentrating the firepower from all the guns aboard each ship, it was a pretty good deterrent that the Germans wouldn't come in too close and attack us. They liked to go after the disabled planes that had drifted off from them and got back here by themselves.
I think one reason that our group didn't have the casualties that some of the groups, some of the squadrons, is we were a little knot up there in the sky. I could always spot our group. It was just tight.
Then on October 14th, the crews assembled in the briefing rooms to learn they would be going after Schweinfurt once again. The news was received by a chorus of groans and shocked gasps amongst the exhausted crews. Still, they climbed aboard their B-17s to do their duty, knowing that today, many of them would not be coming home. They flew into a holocaust of flak and fighters. The Germans were waiting for them, and as soon as their short-ranged P-47 Escorts turned for home, the 109s and 190s attacked. They swarmed through the B-17 formations, blasting the bombers out of the sky with cannons, rockets, and machine guns.
Well, we were going into the ball bearing plant at Schweinfurt, and it was pretty tough going. Heavy flak, being shot at from every direction. And I don't really know what happened, except some people in our squadron that saw us get shot down. But they said one of them rockets shot us. It was obviously a lost cause, and the pilot was losing it. And so they jump out, and I had the last shot that they hit us with had concussion had blown me back against the bulkhead and unplugged my oxygen and my intercom system. And I was a little while, when I finally come to, I realized I didn't hear anybody and my oxygen thing wasn't moving. And so we were only 18,000 feet that day. So I went back to the cockpit, and I was the only guy on that airplane. Everybody else had jumped out. And so I run back and snap my parachute on and jump out. They had this big thing that they'd been trying to stop. The Germans were shooting Americans in parachutes, and the Americans were shooting Germans in parachutes. And both sides were trying to stop it. And here come two ME-109s right at me. They kept getting closer and closer. When they got almost up to me, they reared up like that and circled right tight around me, and both of them saluted. So I saluted, and they went away. And so I just landed in second growth timber, and it was no harder than jumping off the bed.
As the raid drove deeper into Germany, the Luftwaffe responded by throwing everything that could fly into the air at them. Even obsolete Ju-87 Stukas attacked the B-17s, dropping aerial bombs into their tight formations. One bomb group, the 305th, lost 12 planes out of its 27 before even reaching the target area. Those B-17s that reached Schweinfurt dropped their bombs as best they could through a growing pall of smoke that partially obscured the ball-bearing factories. Entire groups missed their targets, and their bombs fell all over the countryside. So many German fighters had attacked the flying forts that most of the American gunners were now running out of ammunition. Meanwhile, the German 109 and 190 squadrons were able to land to rearm and refuel in time to attack the bombers again. Low on ammo, the desperate bomber crews turned for home and endured hour after hour of deadly fighter attack and heavy flak. By the time they reached home, the surviving crews were burnt out and beyond the breaking point. Of the 229 B-17s sent out that day, 60 were shot down, 7 were written off, and 138 more were damaged. Over 630 men of the mighty 8th were either killed, wounded, or captured. In 2 weeks of operations that October, the 8th Air Force had lost over 200 bombers, nearly half its total force. Worse, there was little to show for the terrible casualties. Something had to be done, or the Germans would win the air war. The Army Air Corps had learned its lesson. It was time to throw the pre-war book away and figure out a new way to hit the Germans. The war would not be won with a quick knockout blow against Germany's wartime industries. Rather, it would take a long, sustained campaign to meet 8th Air Force's objectives. And to sustain such an operation, the bombers would need long-range fighter escort.
Well, initially, the 8th Air Force only had P-47 groups available, and they had a very limited range. They could only get to just about the German frontier and back, so they were not able to escort the bombers all the way to target. That posed an increasing problem as the Luftwaffe caused more and more casualties to the 8th Bomber Command. So during the summer of 1943, the 8th Air Force began investigating the use of drop tanks, external fuel tanks that could be slung underneath the fuselage and the wings of their P-47s. So they got very large fuel tanks, up to 108-gallon tanks, I believe, is among the ones that they used. And that was actually able to extend the P-47's radius of action by 100 miles. So they were able to actually go inside Germany and actually could get 375 miles out from England and back. So that had a major effect on the air war, because the P-47s now didn't have to just turn around over Belgium. They could actually tangle with the Luftwaffe over Germany. But at the same time, after the second Schweinfurt raid, the 8th Air Force began demanding long-range fighters. And of course, the only one that was available at the time was the P-38. So in October of 43, the very first P-38s began escorting the bombers, and while they were not as effective as the P-47 or later the P-51, the 38s could at least provide some protection for the bombers, and they could actually go to Berlin and back.
With winter closing in, the 8th Air Force flew less frequently in the final 2 months of 1943. When it did, it confined its attacks mainly to targets outside of Germany. The B-17s would wait for better weather. In the meantime, the 8th Air Force would get new leadership, and they would change America's approach to the air war. In October, General Karl Spaatz took over command of all strategic bombing operations in Europe. He at once realized that the only way to win the air war was to drive the Luftwaffe out of the sky. The flying fortresses had become bait. At the end of February 1944, a 5-day break in the winter weather allowed the 8th Air Force to launch attacks deep into Germany against aircraft factories and airfields. The Luftwaffe rose to the defense and waded into the bomber stream with a vengeance. But then the Lightnings, Thunderbolts, and Mustangs protecting the B-17s pounced on the Germans, savaging their ranks. While the bombers took heavy losses, the Luftwaffe's interceptor units were badly mauled during the week-long battle. 2 weeks later, the 8th Air Force went after Berlin. On the 6th of March, the Germans managed to down 69 B-17s over Berlin. In doing so, however, the Luftwaffe broke its own back. As they desperately tried to defend the Nazi capital, the 109s and 190s were set upon by American fighters and blasted from the sky. On March 8th, the B-17s returned to Berlin, and once again a violent battle raged. When it was over, the German interceptor force had been crippled.
Somebody yelled, "Lightnings!" And I looked around. My gosh, there I saw the lightnings. And they came down, and all of a sudden I saw streamers go by. I said, "Oh boy, somebody's at my tail." And I went a little lower, and by that time I heard a loud bang, and he had cut off part of the right wing, and I just cut it and instinctively put her down.
When the 8th Air Force returned to Berlin the next day, hardly a German fighter was seen, much to the delight of the bomber crews. For the next 3 months, the battle of attrition played out in all its bloody finality. The Germans lost more pilots than they could possibly replace, while the American units were reinforced regularly and never suffered from a shortage of crews. It was a race to see which side would die faster and which side would run out of warm bodies to throw into the fray. It was a race the Germans could not win. From Big Week to the end of May 1944, the Luftwaffe lost 28 of its top aces. During Big Week alone, the Luftwaffe lost 33% of its fighter force and 17.9% of its pilots defending the right. March proved even worse for the Germans, as they lost fully 56% of their fighter aircraft and 22% of their remaining pilots while trying to defend Berlin. Such casualties could not be sustained. The Germans started the year with 2,283 available fighter pilots. By May, 2,262 had been killed or wounded, a 99% loss rate. The Luftwaffe was being bled white. And it was the 8th Air Force that was causing the bleeding. While Allied fighters blasted the Luftwaffe from the sky, the bombers still had targets to hit. Former B-17 crewman Les Hardy takes us on a typical mission deep within the heart of the Third Reich.
They'd wake you up probably 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, and run you down for chow, breakfast, and we didn't get eggs. Somewhere I read that on a combat day you got real eggs. They missed us. We got those powdered eggs, but the cooks did a good job on them. And then by the time you went through briefing and got your flying gear on, your heated suits, you had to wear heated suits. You'd freeze to death up there. And then assembled out at your airplane and got the information from your officers if they had anything. The navigator usually tell us what the weather was supposed to be over the target. And then we'd form up over England, which was quite often dangerous because it might be going through clouds. It was very foggy. They didn't even attempt it, but it wasn't unusual to have air-to-air collisions while you were forming up. But eventually we'd get formed up and in formation and head across the channel. And you were stuck in that airplane for quite a few hours when you went to Berlin. No, nothing to eat. I think they gave us a candy bar. One time they gave us an orange. That works real good at 28,000 feet, 60 below. We could have thrown those at the enemy. Getting to Berlin, quite often we'd encounter Flak because they had their 88s mounted on rail cars and trucks, and they moved them around, and I swear they knew where we were, what our flight pattern was. Because quite often we'd get Flak on the way, and you didn't dodge around it. You had to stay on your course. But as you approached Berlin, if some other group was ahead of you, the air was black with Flak, and that's what you had to fly through. On the bomb run, the bombardier, the pilot turned the thing on autopilot, so the bombardier controlled the airplane on the flight over the target, because he's the one that's aiming the Sperry at the ground. So he just flew through that like that was the only way to go. And it was very exciting. I'd like to have been able to shoot at something, but of course I couldn't do that. I could see plenty good through the top of my radio shack. It was wide open. The two little windows on the side weren't very good for seeing things, but I could see enough. Probably all I wanted to.
With the Luftwaffe on its knees, the 8th Air Force turned its attention to supporting the D-Day invasion and subsequent campaign in Normandy. The flying fortresses hit coastal emplacements and other targets along the beaches just prior to the landings, then took part in carpet bombing operations against German troops. One such mission virtually destroyed the German Panzer Lehr Division in July of 1944 and helped pave the way for the American breakout from the beachhead. Once the Allied armies broke out of Normandy and began driving toward Germany, the 8th Air Force turned to new targets in hopes of shortening the war. Up until early September of 1944, the heavy bombers had mainly attacked aircraft factories, U-boat assembly plants, or pens, docks, and ball bearing factories. In May, the bombers had begun hitting oil refineries and synthetic fuel plants. D-Day delayed hitting any more of these targets until the fall of 1944, but in September, the mighty 8th returned to Germany and systematically destroyed the Reich's ability to process fuel. The attacks were an incredible success. By December, the 8th Air Force had knocked out almost half of Germany's refineries, precipitating a fuel crisis within the German army. Just when the Wehrmacht needed mobility the most, its panzers ground to a halt for want of oil and gas. Desperate measures were tried to get around this problem, including the construction of charcoal-burning engines that tanks could use, but they were too little, too late. The Flying Fortress had at last delivered the knockout punch the pre-war bomber advocates fervently believed it could do. At the same time, the 8th's bombers were used to attack marshalling yards and rail centers throughout Germany.
Mainly, most of my missions in those days were the marshalling yards. We were trying to destroy the transportation system so they couldn't move anything around by train. And we did. We really destroyed the area, because later on when I went to Germany, it took me 5 days to go on train because they